Welcome to this data analytics tutorial that covers sales, cost, and gross profit analysis using pivot tables and charts in Excel. In this activity, we are using a sales and cost data set for a fictitious company, Cabinet Accessories Company, CAC. The sales and cost data covers 2014 to 2018. For this tutorial only, we are using a small 36 record data set. For the actual activity, you will be using the full data set, so your answers for the activity requirements will be different, but the process will be similar. For this tutorial on pivot tables and pivot charts, we will be demonstrating using Office 365 Excel for Windows. Other versions of Excel may be slightly different. Also note that there may be many ways of accomplishing the same thing. We are just presenting one way here. Make sure your version of Office 365 is updated. You may not see things the same way if you have not updated recently. Start this activity by opening the Excel workbook containing the data set. In general, for each of the requirements in this activity except for requirement 1, create a new pivot table and a new worksheet. Name each new worksheet as requirement 2, requirement 3, etc. If instructed, format the dollar amounts in each pivot table or pivot chart using the accounting format with 2 decimal places. Requirement 1 asks, create 3 columns in the data worksheet that calculate sales revenue, cost, and gross profit for each sales record. For the first step in the first requirement, go to cell K2 in the data worksheet, which is the cell under the column heading Sales Revenue. Enter the formula for sales revenue, which is equal H2 times J2. Point to the cells rather than typing them in. For the second step, click in cell L2, which is right below the column heading Total Cost. Enter the formula for total cost, which is equal I2 times J2. Again, point to the cells rather than typing in the names. For the third column, click in cell M2, which is the cell right below the column heading of gross profit. Enter the formula for gross profit, which is sales revenue minus total cost, or equal K2 minus L2. Again, point to the cells rather than typing them in. There is a lot less potential for error that way. In the fourth step, copy the 3 formulas down to the rest of the rows by selecting the 3 cells and then double-clicking the small box in the lower right-hand corner of cell M2. For step 5, format the 3 columns by selecting the columns and then clicking on Format, Accounting Format with 2 decimal places. That's it! You have added 3 formatted columns to the data worksheet. Requirement 2 states, create a pivot table that shows sales revenue by region for each year. Correct any errors in the data set. Insert a pivot chart to show sales trends. The first step is to click anywhere in the data worksheet. Next, on the ribbon, click Insert and then Pivot Table. Before we go any further, right-click the Worksheet Name tab and rename it Requirement 2. That will help to keep track of the different pivot tables. By the way, if the Pivot Table Fields panel ever disappears, you can bring it back by clicking anywhere in the pivot table you have created. The next step is to drag Region in the Pivot Table Fields panel down to the Rows box, Sales Revenue down to the Values box, and Date of Sale down to the Columns box. Number 5. Examine the pivot table now. Look for errors. Here we see that Central has been entered as Centrals at least once in the data set. When you work on the large assigned data set, there may be different errors, but the same visual inspection technique will work to find any errors. Now switch back to the data worksheet and click on Find and Select in the Home ribbon. Select Find and Replace. Type in the error terms you found in the pivot table and click Find Next. Replace with the corrected spelling. Do this process for each error you find in the pivot table. Here we had just one, centrals, instead of the correct central. For step 7, return to the Requirement 2 worksheet. Click in the data in the pivot table. Right-click and select Refresh. This process should update the pivot table so the errors you corrected are no longer in the pivot table. Next, we will format the data in the pivot table. Select the pivot table data and right-click to select Value Field Settings. Select Number Format and then format the pivot table cells as accounting with 2 decimal places. Now we are going to insert a pivot chart in the same worksheet. Select the pivot table data. On the Insert ribbon, click on Pivot Chart. Next, select the line type of chart and then click on OK. The pivot chart now appears in the worksheet. However, we need to switch the data rows and columns. To switch the rows and columns, right-click the chart and click on Select Data. Next, click on the Switch Row Column button at the top of the box. Now click OK to finalize the switch of the rows and columns. The pivot table rows and columns now have been switched, as well as the pivot chart data. Requirement 3 reads, create a pivot table that shows sales revenue, costs, and gross profit for each year. What is the impact on retained earnings each year? The first step is to click anywhere in the data worksheet. Click on the Insert tab and then click on Pivot Table. Next, accept the defaults and click on OK. Before we go any further, right-click the Worksheet Name tab and rename it Requirement 3. That will just help to keep track of the various pivot tables. In the next step, drag Years in the Pivot Table Fields panel down to the Rows box. Drag Sales Revenue, Total Cost, and Gross Profit down to the Values box. Next, select the pivot table data. Right-click and select Value Field Settings. Next, click on Number Format. Select Accounting Format with 2 decimal places. This pivot table that shows sales revenue, total cost, and gross profit by year is now finished. The requirements for the data project ask to calculate the net impact on retained earnings in each of the years from the transactions. Remember that gross profit will increase retained earnings. Requirement 4 reads, create a pivot table that shows the most profitable brand in each year as measured by gross profit. The first step is to click anywhere in the data worksheet. Click on the Insert tab and then click on Pivot Table. Accept the defaults and click on OK. Before we go any further, right-click the Worksheet Name tab and rename it Requirement 4. That will help to keep track of the pivot tables. In the next step, drag Years in the Pivot Table Fields panel down to the Columns box. Drag Brand and Collection down to the Rows box. Drag Gross Profit down to the Values box. Next, select the pivot table data, right-click, click Value Field Settings, Number Format, and Format as Accounting with 2 decimal places. The pivot table is now done. It shows the most profitable brand each year. Requirement 5 reads, within each brand, what was the most profitable collection in 2018 as measured by the gross profit percentage? The least most profitable collection for each brand? Use the field years to filter the data to include just the year of 2018. You will need to add a calculated field to the pivot table to calculate the gross profit percentage. Within each brand, sort the collections by gross profit percentage from the largest to the smallest. Interpret your findings. The first step is to click anywhere in the data worksheet. Next, click on Insert and then Pivot Table. Next, accept the defaults for the pivot table and click OK. Before we go any further, right-click the Worksheet Name tab and rename it Requirement 5. Numbering the worksheet helps to keep track of the pivot tables. Next, drag years in the pivot table fields panel down to the filters box. Drag brand and collection down to the rows box. Finally, drag gross profit down to the values box. Next, in the Analyze ribbon, click on Fields, Items, and Sets to add a calculated field. For the next step, insert calculated field using the name of Gross Profit PCT and the formula of equal gross profit divided by sales revenue. Point to the fields and click Insert rather than typing them in. Next, select the data in the gross profit column and right-click. Select Value Field Settings, Number Format, and Format as a Percentage. In the next step, in the Years filter box, select 2018 as the year to display only 2018 data. Click on a cell in the pivot table at the collection level. Here we will click on cell C5. Next, right-click and select Sort and then sort largest to smallest. The pivot table is finished. We can see the most profitable and least profitable brands as measured by gross profit dollars. Requirement 6 reads, create a pivot table to answer the question, which region was the most profitable in 2018 as measured by the gross profit percentage? Use a filter to include only sales from 2018 in this pivot table. Again, you will need to add a calculated field to the pivot table to calculate the gross profit percentage. Sort the regions by gross profit percentage from largest to smallest. The first step is to click anywhere in the data worksheet. On the Insert ribbon, click on Pivot Table and accept the defaults to insert a new pivot table in the workbook. Before we go any further, right-click the Worksheet Name tab and rename it Requirement 6. That will help to keep track of the pivot tables. Next, drag Years in the Pivot Table Fields panel down to the Filters box. Drag Region down to the Rows box. Finally, drag Gross Profit and Gross Profit Percentage down to the Values box. Select the data in the Sum of Gross Profit Percentage column, right-click and select Value Field Settings. Next, in the Value Field Settings, select the Number Format box. Format the data as percentage with 2 decimal places and click OK. In the Filter box in the upper right corner of the worksheet, select 2018 as the year. Sort the data from largest to smallest, even though here in this small data set it is already in that order. In the large data set, sorting from largest to smallest will make a difference. That's it. We can see the most profitable region in 2018 as measured by gross profit percentage. That concludes this data analytics tutorial covering sales, cost, and gross profit analysis using pivot tables and charts in Excel. Thanks for watching.